Ni hao, and welcome to episode 12 of my vlog about Mao's China. This time we're looking at topic 4 of the EdXL specification, focusing on Mao's China, and that is the topic about social and cultural change. This topic looks all the way across from 1949 to 1976 and considers the story of women and education and health, religion and cultural change um, in that sweep of 27 years of Maoist rule. Because of that, your questions in this area, unless they're source questions, of course, focusing on a particular part or strand of that, they're more likely to be questions that look at change and continuity, the success perhaps of a particular policy, or how much change it brought about for women or for education. Or perhaps you might be asked to compare the significance of policies across women against religion or health or education, and which is the most significant of the social and cultural changes. At this time, in this episode, we'll be looking at women, and next episode, we'll think about health and education, and the one after, cultural change and religion. So each of these follows a fairly similar pattern, to be honest. Before 1949, things tended to be quite bad. And then Maoist policies tend to be pretty decent in terms of changing things and bringing about progression in the short term. And then into the 60s with the Cultural Revolution, things tend to kind of unravel and get a little bit harder. So that's particularly the story with women. Before 1949, things are poor for women, it's fair to say. Confucianism is the dominant kind of social ideology of China before the revolution. And under that system, there's a very real sense of hierarchy and of knowing your place within that hierarchy. Because of that, women were compelled by the three obediences: firstly, to their father when they were young, and then when they married, to their husband, and then as they grew older, to their eldest son. A birth of a girl was seen as being less exciting than the birth of a boy because of the way that girls would leave the family to join another family in their arranged marriage. And girls were persecuted through the barbaric, I think it's fair to say, policy of foot binding. This was the idea that girls with smaller feet were more attractive, and therefore, at a young age, they were lots of girls had their feet broken, and their toes would be bent under their feet and then bound tightly in order to stunt the growth of their feet and make them more attractive until they took off their shoes and socks, I guess. Young Chang writes about her grandmother having this done to her at the age of 2 or 3, I think. This had actually been outlawed in 1911 and the original Chinese Revolution, but it's a practice that still persisted through to 1949, and the communists stand against that and against several other aspects of persecution of women. Another big thing was the arranging of marriages. Mao himself had started to campaign against this way back in 1907, when at the age of 14, he had a marriage arranged to a 21-year-old girl, and the bride price had already been paid when Mao refused to go through with the marriage. This is the idea that the bride's parents had paid money to Mao's family, which was a common practice in that era. The other thing, and actually Mao got involved again in arranged marriages in 1919. Again, years before the communists got into power in 1919, when in Changsha a bride actually slit her own throat at the wedding, to great drama and horror. Rather than go through the arranged marriage, and Mao spoke out public about this and wrote some articles as a young man against arranged marriage. The other thing that persisted in China into the early 20th century was concubinage. This is the practice of marrying, but then taking a mistress into your household as well. So the wife kind of performed the domestic duties, the official stuff, and the concubine was there for sexual pleasure and for the physical side of a relationship. And this is obviously quite humiliating, massively humiliating for the wife, and an archaic practice. Women were also polyeducated before 1949. In the 1930s, an estimated 1% of women had basic literacy skills. It wasn't hugely high for men, about 30%, but still massively higher than for women. So in 1949, the communists came to power with a promise to change all this through their 1949 party program. Mao said that women hold up half the sky and immediately began trying to bring about equality for them. It was to end feudalism, his practice is hierarchical practice, and then Confucianism. It's one of the four olds and kind of an ancient practice which the communists saw as being outmoded and outdated. And they established the All China Women's Federation to protect the rights of women as they were passed and to promote the policies that were being done. There were an estimated 76 million members of that Women's Federation, and they campaigned against prostitution, domestic violence, and they encouraged women to confront and denounce men who had beaten their wives. Probably the most important single piece of legislation that they passed was the marriage law of 1950, an early and deliberate example of how they took active steps to promote the equality of women. Remember, they've only just won the Civil War at this stage. They're still sorting out the economy. They haven't reunited China fully. So this is a big priority for them. It seems to be a genuine part of the progressive ideas that Mao did have in these areas, even though you might not like him in other areas. So the marriage law ended concubinage, polygamy, the practice of marrying more than one wife, and arranged marriages. That marriage was from here on in meant to be a free choice between husband and wife. There were no more bride payments, and within the marriage, the man and the woman had equal status, so that divorce was made easier. Either the man or the woman could bring about divorce proceedings, but not if the wife was pregnant or within a year of giving birth. Also, if the man died, the wife could inherit the land for the first time ever. And this practice was not only passed as a law, but also enthusiastically put out amongst the public or campaigned for amongst the public. So that up until 1955, there were yearly propaganda campaigns organised to publicise the law all over China. By that stage, 90% of all marriages had been officially registered, and these were considered to have been not arranged, that would be a bad word, concluded in free will. By the 1960s, child marriages and arranged marriages were extremely rare. So this was a big success for the Communist Party and a huge leap forward for women. But it's fair to say the fact that there were yearly campaigns up to 1955 illustrates that progress was hard in some areas. And it's easy to change the law, but not so easy to change people's views or opinions about things. And so in some areas there was much more resistance than in others. In the northwest, in Xinjiang province, which is further away from Chinese communist influence, traditional policies persisted. That's a traditionally Muslim area. There are also areas which are more traditionally Confucian and held on to those practices for longer than others. Nevertheless, it is a big step forward. It's also worth saying that the introduction of the law also led to a large number of divorces, some murders and suicides as that policy shook out. Mao also brought in policies to bring about the education of women. We'll talk about education in the next podcast, but it's worth saying that between 1929 and 1949, about 38% of girls completed primary education. We've already said that very few of them ever learned basic literacy skills. But after 1959, 100% did. Slightly sceptical about the 100%, but about a third before the Civil War and almost everyone after 1959. By 1978, a couple of years after Mao's death, 45% of primary school children were girls, so almost kind of 50-50 there. Also, it's worth noting that women were encouraged, or young women were encouraged, to join the PLA, and this was another sign of equality, that women could join the army, and they could even be promoted to officer rank, which was unheard of before the Civil War. So, great progress was made. However, women's prospects were badly affected by collectivization. In theory, this should have been actually another step forward in that equality was taken to an absolute maximum, and women were given further opportunities at having that equality because of the provision of canteens and childcare would release them to work on the land alongside men. But in reality, those facilities were actually very limited. And the physical work through which you gained work points for exchange for food and other things, women were necessarily and obviously less capable in that and less productive in the physical work, and so therefore gained fewer work points. There was also a fair amount of abuse in the communists, sexual abuse and other abuse, and another abuse being that women who were pregnant were still forced to work in the field, and so miscarriages were quite common amongst women at that time. Also, at that time, the dislocation and separation of families was undermined the family unit, and that was a deliberate policy by the communists who saw family units being bourgeois and uncommunist. And of course, the property gains that women had made under the Marriage Act were now wiped out by the state ownership of all land. The famine was particularly hard for all people, and probably hardest for young people, children, infants, and then very older people. But it's not a great time for women either. The divorce rate increased through that famine period between 1958 and 62. It went up 60% in Gansu province. Gansu is Gansu. Prostitution and wife selling also became practices which were if not commonplace, were seen much more frequently. Just as a side note, the famine also caused some reflection on population size, which affected women too. The population of China had been 540 million in 1949, and that rose to 940 million by 1976. Mao often trumpets the great size of China as being one of its strengths, but there were already concerns in the mid-50s before the famine about providing enough resources for that huge population, and the famine really crystallizes those concerns. And so from 1962, contraceptives were made really widely available, and pressure begins to be placed upon women not to have so many children. This leads in 1971 to an official policy to restrict population growth to just 2%, and propaganda campaign to encourage families to be have no more than 2 children each. And that's a precursor of the famous one-child policy, which was brought in 1979. So that obviously impacts upon women and their role in Chinese society too. It's worth saying that the Cultural Revolution kind of provides both good and bad things for women. The good things probably were that the Maoist uniform brought about, again, another symbol of equality, as women were able to wear that alongside men. Jiang Qing became an example of how women could provide leadership within China, and that was reflected in lots of women who were leaders within their Red Guard units. And cultural propaganda, such as the Red Detachment of Women, which was a 1961 ballet about women fighting in the Civil War, was made into a film in 1970 during the Cultural Revolution. So women were promoted as being an equal part of this society. Overall, you'd have to say that women are made into a key part of society and are seen as being equal with men in lots of ways. The amount of women in work in China in the Maoist era rose from 8% to 32%, but they were still less than a third of the whole workforce. And that's kind of like, I guess, my conclusion really, that women were promoted in lots of ways, but they still kind of fall short of true equality. They tended to benefit in terms of being able to fulfill traditionally male roles, but and there was equality in that sense. They could do those things, but it was much harder for them to get equality and still be valued for female roles. Especially when the family was being attacked by communes, which are trying to break that down, the family unit, or during the Cultural Revolution, when family is seen as being one of like the four olds or bourgeois values. Deng Yulan is a good example of that. Deng Yulan is spelled Deyulan. She was promoted as a model worker for agriculture alongside other model workers, kind of like the Chinese equivalent of the Stakhanovites from the Soviet Union, I guess. However, she was not well promoted at all and not nationally known. And if you search for her, there's very little information out there about her. And this is a sign about how both women were respected and promoted and seen as equal, but also not so much at the same time. Thanks for watching. See you next time.